Welcome to VLGA Connect. My name is Catherine Arndt and I'm the Chief of the VLGA Connect studio. I hope you enjoy today's Connect episode brought to you by the VLGA, the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Good evening, everyone, and good morning to those of you joining us from a different time zone, and welcome to the latest VLGA LGIU Global Executive Panel. The topic tonight is COP26, 1 year on, and it's not lost on me, and I'm sure not lost on you, that COP27 is underway as we speak. Looking forward to hearing from our terrific speakers in just a few moments. But before we commence, I would like to introduce firstly Ciaran Hayes, the CEO of the VLGA, to say a few words of welcome. Ciaran.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome everyone. We're very happy to once again be hosting our quarterly Global Executive Live panels in partnership with LGIU. This is a partnership that we've established now for a few years, and I must say increasingly is getting quite a huge following, and I think there's absolutely no doubt why, and that is because of not only the relevance of the topics that we discuss, but also the quality and calibre and experience of the panellists that we have joining us. And I think the panellists, and Chris will introduce them shortly. I thank all of the participants who have come in and joined us tonight to hear this important conversation. I'm actually calling in from an airport lounge, so I will turn my mute off, my microphone off shortly to avoid any flight calls, but I'll hand back over to Chris now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ciaran. And of course, these events are a partnership with LGIU, and we're very pleased to have Jonathan Carr-West with us, the CEO of LGIU, to say a few words of welcome on behalf of his organisation. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, Chris. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us this morning. For those of you who don't know LGIU, we're a not-for-profit that operates in the UK, in Ireland, and in Australia. We look to support local government to help them innovate, help them cope with some of the complex challenges we have by sharing information and best practice. And these events are a great example of that, as we bring together chief execs from around the world to kind of put their heads together around some of the really kind of knotty issues that we face. And I think what I hope you'll find, because we found this every time, and it's a great partnership with VLGA, and thanks to them for doing it with us, is that we see real shared problems, and that things look different from different parts of the world, but there are commonalities. There are things we can learn from each other. There are things we can share, and it really helps everyone, I think, to sort of take that forward. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. I'm sure you're all going to get a lot out of it. To those of you who are LGIU members, many thanks. To those of you who are not, do take a look at the website. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And I do know you need to fade into the background as well, so appreciate you providing that intro. Very importantly, on behalf of the VLGA and LGIU, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria and wherever you are joining us from on this session today. We recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community, and we pay our respects to the traditional owners, their elders past, present and future, and to their cultures. Now, I would like to ask just a couple of housekeeping things of our audience this evening, please. If you can have your camera on, that is always useful, particularly once we get to the interactive part of the session. But please keep your microphone on mute unless you're asking a question or participating in the discussion at some point through the next hour and a bit. I'd like to briefly introduce our panellists before we get into the presentations. And firstly, Dr Rosemary Dillon, the CEO of Blue Mountains City Council in New South Wales, Australia, is with us. Good evening, Rosemary. Thank you. Nice to have you here. We have Darcy Pimblett, who is the Program Development and Partnerships Manager with Cities Power Partnership. We'll hear from Darcy about that organisation and how it's working with councils around Australia. Ciaran Hayes is joining us at 2:36 a.m. from Boston, where he's a Harvard Senior Fellow, a former CEO of Sligo County Council in Ireland, and lots of stories to tell us about his involvement with local governments and climate action. Thank you for joining us, Ciaran, particularly at that time of the night for you. And our first speaker is Lawrence Conway, who is the CEO of South Lakeland District Council in the UK. Lawrence has been in that position since 2010 and has been in the public sector since the late 90s at district and unitary councils. Prior to that, 15 years in private sector, working in environmental services, logistics, finance, waste and resources and change management. Lawrence is keen to ensure that any economic strategy in the UK has substance and structure, but is also carried out in conjunction with a key commitment to carbon reduction, societal climate adaptation and increasing biodiversity. Lawrence, I know you've got some slides. We might just give you a second to bring those up. I know your region has experienced a series of what you call so-called once-in-a-lifetime events, and you're going to take us through how your local authority has been responding to these events and adapting for a changing climate. Take it away, Lawrence Conway.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. And I have stolen, hopefully you can see that first slide, everybody. I have stolen a little bit of the rhetoric at the beginning of COP27, just to highlight the media attention that was given at that time. The road to climate hell is, I think, what we all heard. But I think there is a solution, or there are solutions to that, and perhaps this is the start of the road to climate redemption. And so, there's two ways of looking at things. And I think local authorities, in particular, along with the people that they serve, have a really important role in that. So, all that thinking globally, acting locally, I'm sure we're all very aware of that reference. My first slide, forgive me, because I've utilised a presentation that I did a couple of weeks ago to a group of aspiring leaders from local authorities, and it was how to deal with an emergency. And so there were a couple of other examples given in here, like train crashes and things like that. But what I found was it was easily adaptable to this particular session. And I'm just going to outline for colleagues from different locations across the globe where we are. So that's the UK. You can see there that Cumbria is the county. And there is a little squiggle just below the word Cumbria. That's actually Lake Windermere. So for those that are aware of where it is. And South Lakeland is a part of Cumbria, and Lake Windermere is within our patch, along with many of the hotspots of the Lake District National Park. And that has a bearing on how climate change and our adaptability to that is reflected in the work that we have to do, and I'll explain that in a moment. So this is Cumbria. That gives you a little bit more detail of where we are. You'll see South Lakeland at the bottom, the sort of a darker greenish patch just to the right of Barrow. It's got Kendal, Ulverston, Grange over Sands, Bowness, etc., etc. So just giving you a bit of a flavour as to how the area is worked out. In the middle of all of that is the Lake District fells and mountains. And again, that has an impact on the type of response and the type of ecology that we're dealing with as a community. So this was Kendal town centre, or just off Kendal town centre in 2015. Just to give you some idea of the visuals of what was going on a particular weekend. And there you can see that's not the high street, that's just off the high street. Never been flooded before, ever. And what we were finding there, it wasn't just a river, because there's a river, a very fast flowing, fast rising river through the centre of Kendal, the River Kent. But what we were finding this time was that the rain was so hard, that the ground was so sodden, that it's actually rising up through different places that we'd never thought it would. So it's the groundwater rather than the rivers overflowing. And that created a very different scenario than what we'd had before. And again, we had Storm Arwen last year. And I'll just, a picture there of one of our car parks that, the trees are blown over. Unfortunately, we had a fatality in one of the council's parks during the night, where somebody was coming home from the pub and unfortunately a tree fell on them. So it's a really serious thing for us. And the sort of theme of the talk was once in a lifetime events. Well, they're clearly not for us. And the reason I put the map up is that this is just a small piece of the world, and if it's going on where we are in that area of the world, then you look at all the floods in Pakistan and all of those things. It's happening everywhere, but it's not once in a lifetime. So I've been here and chief exec. I've actually worked for South Lakeland since 2001, and what we're seeing now is more frequent events. So, and they're getting bigger. So you can see there the storms have flooded in January 2005, 1,500 properties, then 2009, 2,000 properties. Those pictures I showed you just earlier was 3,000 properties and businesses, which is quite big for a town with about 12,000 to 15,000 properties. And then the recent storm Arwen was around 6,000 properties that were without power. Almost 1,000 of them were without power for over a week, which is unheard of, and mostly in rural areas that were really hard to get to with an elderly population. So in terms of the future, these are not once in a lifetime events. So we need to plan as such, and that's exactly what we do within the council. Everything that we do now is on the premise that climate action and biodiversity feeds through all of those things. But I have to say that's not what everybody does. So it's not always easy, even though you were affected quite considerably by some of these things. Not everybody around you that has an influence on you thinks the same way. And so just to give you again some of the consequences of those particular flooding events, and certainly the one with Storm Dedman in 2015, we've now got a new footbridge which was opened 2 weeks ago, 7 years after the flood, and it cost £3 million because we have to have single span now because we can no longer put pillars into the river for very obvious reasons. There is a flood scheme, a significant flood scheme for a town of 30,000 people that's now costing over £100 million for that flood defence. And that is to, it's not just to protect the homes and the businesses, but also to give people confidence that they can still invest in this particular area. Because the last thing you want is when you read the map and you're looking for investment is to see a big floodplain. And if you see those figures, it's happening on a more regular basis. So something has to be done, and we're very grateful that the Environment Agency has been able to do that work on our behalf. So I mentioned earlier about the adaptations to the changing climate and biodiversity. And I think, for all of us, these things are changing. So we're having to look at our housing stock, not just public, but private. We've got one of the worst housing stocks for insulation in the country because much of it is old. It's not brick, it's stone. If you've ever been to the Lake District, you'll see those lovely houses made out of Lakeland stone, but they are increasingly difficult to insulate against. Our town centres, as I showed the pictures earlier, now need to be more resilient to flooding, to storms, to power and energy interruptions. Again, I've mentioned energy, and we all know what's going on with energy across the world at the moment, the cost of living. Our waste streams, our transport infrastructure, we were cut off for over 24 hours from the outside world, which was quite useful actually, because none of the media could get in and sort of take pictures at the time, so we were able to get on with the rescue job. But we were cut off for quite some time. And then we all know about food, environment and societal changes, things that people are doing differently. And very often it requires a shock to the system to do that. COVID was a good example. where we were planning a transformation of the council around home working, etc., which we thought would take us about a decade to bring in, but it happened overnight. And so, you know, there are some real shocks to the system that perhaps are required for people to really wake up to what's going on. So for us, having a local plan, or a council plan as we call it, is, and I say this irrespective of the current international and national government policies, and is to make sure that climate adaptation is central to that plan. It's very easy to read the news, which I did this morning before coming on, just to see how much was in the media this morning on COP27. And I'm not pleased to say that there was absolutely nothing on the BBC's website or Sky's website or Apple News about what's going on and the discussions that were going on. So we've got a bit of a job to do. But that doesn't mean that whilst the global stage is as it is, that we can't make local plans to adapt to local circumstances. I think that's really important. Many of the things that we'll see around the world actually start very small and gather momentum very quickly. So, and then let everyone know about the plan. One of the most difficult things is to make sure that, particularly when people are struggling with other issues like the cost of living, like poverty, like vulnerabilities, it's important that we have the communications that actually reach out to those, to different sectors of society, because one message for one is completely useless for another. If you're struggling to pay the bills, then the last thing you're going to think about is recycling your paper, your waste, your glass, your cans, because life's hard enough. So there has to be, from my perspective, a comms that different variety of communications for different sectors of the community to make sure that they have the best possible chance of actually responding to where we are. And then I've put local civic leadership, but you could ramp that up to global, international, whatever you want. But what we've certainly found is that by the council and the councils, with their councillors, and particularly the leaders of the councils, they can set the tone, they can set the direction of travel. And that is a really, really powerful way of making sure that things like the council plan get delivered, and that the resources that are required get delivered to the right places. So I'll leave it there for now, Chris, if that's okay, and look forward to the panel discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lawrence, for those insights. I have a feeling we're going to have some recurring themes in the discussions that we're having this evening. Next up, I'd like to introduce Dr Rosemary Dillon, the Chief Executive Officer of Blue Mountains City Council, and we'll bring Rosemary's slides up. There we go. Rosemary has 30 years experience in local government and is passionately committed to the role that local government can play in taking local action to support planetary health. And more recently, she's led the council and the city through recovery from multiple disasters. I said recurring themes. There's been a couple of them there already, and has driven a collaborative, strategy-led, service-focused organisation. Rosemary, good evening, and over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. As we reflect on where we are 1 year out from COP26, and as we seriously appreciate that we are not where we need to be, I would like tonight to focus on three things. Firstly, the utter necessity for action at every level, and especially by local governments across the world, to achieve planetary health. I will focus briefly on our sustainability journey since 2000 to now. Secondly, I want to focus on the critical urgency for mass education and understanding that we cannot have unlimited and infinite growth on a finite planet. There are limits to growth, and we still don't get that. This means we need to change the way we use resources, the way we do our economy, cities, and local government areas, so that natural systems supporting all life are actually valued restored and not destroyed. Thirdly, I want to touch on the role local government can play in shaping compelling visions and facilitating action and initiatives that support planetary health. And importantly, that empower and give us hope for the future. Because I think we've got to do this, especially for our young people, despite the tipping points. These need to offer alternatives to the unlimited growth paradigm. I'd like to also begin by acknowledging that the City of Blue Mountains is located within the Nara, or country of the Darug and Gundungurra peoples, and Blue Mountains City Council recognises that Darug and Gundungurra people have a continuous and deep connection to country. So who are we, the City of Blue Mountains? Well, we're one of only 2 cities in the world situated right smack within a World Heritage National Park. The Greater Blue Mountains area was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2000 for its outstanding natural universal values. And being located in a World Heritage area, our key challenge has been, how do we foster the social and economic well-being without destroying that wonderful Blue Mountains environment that surrounds us? And our key opportunity, which we realised many decades ago, was to use the World Heritage as a catalyst for becoming a leader and model in living and working sustainably. Easier said than done. Managing urban development in the City of Blue Mountains so that it doesn't impact the amazing biodiversity and natural systems surrounding us is a major challenge, especially given our topography as a city on the edge, literally. Over the last 3 years, the City of Blue Mountains has been declared a natural disaster 4 times. This is unprecedented. In 2019, 2020, we had bushfires surrounding the city on 3 sides, and they destroyed an estimated 80% of our World Heritage landscape with massive loss of unique flora and fauna. We've had extreme wet weather flooding events in March 2020, February 21, March and July 2022, resulting in damage to almost 1/3 of the road network and 66 landslides. Our estimated repair bill currently and growing is over 400 million Australian dollars, and we now need to build back better. But our infrastructure needs to be resilient to withstand the future disasters that will come. Between 2000 and 2002, the City of Blue Mountains engaged on an exciting journey, engaging community in shaping what was to become a nationally award-winning vision and map for action known as Towards a More Sustainable Blue Mountains 2025. This is still guiding our city. Our community vision is that the City of Blue Mountains is recognised nationally and internationally as a creative model for sustainable living and learning about sustainable communities. It has been critical in proactively embedding sustainability principles into the way we actually manage the city, environmentally, socially, and economically. We developed also, which you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, the Blue Mountains Sustainability Model as part of this work. The model attempts to show the need for action at all levels in the top part, taking action individually by households, locally, regionally. So we all work together to improve quality, not just of humans, but of all life and the health of the planet. And so we strengthen rather than erode the natural, social and built capital and assets supporting life on this planet. Now, over the last decade since we did this work, much action has happened and is currently underway in the Blue Mountains to improve and restore planetary health. There's too much to detail, but a few highlights. In May 21, we adopted the Blue Mountains Aboriginal Advisory Council's Statement of Recognition and Commitment. This is a historic statement and provides a guiding vision of how we can further respect the unbroken connection that our Gundungurra and Darug traditional owners hold with their country, Nara. In March, recently, we also resolved to integrate the rights of nature into Council's operations and planning. We're in the very final stages of gaining eco-destination certification from Ecotourism Australia. And we've framed now in our plans that the City of Blue Mountains is an eco-city. In 2019, we declared a climate emergency, the 3rd LGA in Australia. Our carbon abatement action plan, established in 2016, has a target of achieving net zero emissions by 2025. We're upgrading all our remaining streetlights at the moment to be energy efficient LEDs and also including lower Kelvin bulbs for dark sky zones. We're installing EV electrical vehicle charging stations, and we have begun implementing our Towards Zero Waste strategy with a focus on circular economy. I'm really excited to say we're now in the process of creating a Planetary Health Leadership Centre, which we hope will be of local, regional, national and international significance. This is all part of a wider citywide planetary health initiative. We are working very hard to make our local government area an exemplar and a living laboratory, demonstrating local action for planetary health. But I'm the first to acknowledge we still have a very long way to go on this journey, and we do not always get it right. And local government is political, and we have to work with all the stakeholders to make things work. However, our sustainability-focused vision and action plan has absolutely made a massive difference over the last couple of decades in how we focus resources, how we do our planning, our policies, and most importantly, achieving results on the ground. And we couldn't do this initiative without many partners that are critical. And the first I'd like to acknowledge is our huge network of community volunteers. We've got 500 local volunteers and 600 local school students working on bush regeneration that just celebrated its 30th anniversary, and waterway projects in other areas. We're working in partnerships with Monash, Western Sydney, Notre Dame, University of Technology and Sydney University, and with the Blue Mountains World Heritage Institute and National Parks and Wildlife Service. Just a taste of some of the current initiatives we're working on: a bioregional collaboration between Blue Mountains and our adjoining city Lithgow to the west, focusing on fire, flood and heatwave disaster, risk mitigation through harvesting and reusing rainwater and stormwater. We're part of a Western Sydney energy program aiming to reduce Western Sydney emissions by 200,000 tonnes of CO2 per year. We're part of Resilience Sydney, and we're also a member of Cities Power Partnership. Now, one of the most important areas for our Planetary Health Initiative has been working to empower and give hope to young people. And I acknowledge our senior lead for Planetary Health, Liz Baston, who's on this session right now as well. She's played a major role in this work. We have been implementing circular learning economy programs. We've been training young people in planetary health and permaculture, and we've been supporting them to achieve livelihoods that restore planetary health. We've been supporting young people in a wide range of social enterprises, including an innovative Farm It Forward program where young people go to the land of older people and grow vegetable gardens, and that produce then is shared with the older people, but also with our food cooperatives. We're partnering with PhD and other research students and citizen scientist programs, and we're working with Sydney Uni on the Global Grounded Imaginaries project, which is saying it can't all be doom and gloom, and we must work together to imagine a positive future. Because as Danella Meadows said, if you don't have that compelling vision of what the alternative is to the high consumption growth, then we will never get anywhere different from that scenario and growth paradigm, which is unfortunately dominating what's happening across the globe. Further, she says, if even once we get to having that positive vision, it will take time to change, which is why it's even more critical we act. So we are implementing our planetary health pluriversity, which instead of a university, which is learning from many voices in many ways. So these are all initiatives that are in development. Our communities and our communities across the world, they need to understand the fierce urgency for action now. I too looked to see if COP27 was in the media in Australia, and I could not find it yesterday. So we have a choice. Are we going to keep reacting and adapting to the consequences of unsustainable economic growth and climate change? Or are we going to work together at every level to restore and regenerate nature and create the required systems change to achieve planetary health? Local governments, without a doubt, are well placed to facilitate, lead and implement a bottom-up planetary health revolution, nothing less, that restores and regenerates natural systems, builds healthy communities and sustainable circular economy. Having a community-owned vision where you've engaged extensively with your community to build that vision and action plan. The action plan provides the map and a lighthouse for achieving that positive vision that Donella Meadows talked about for planetary health is critical. We have to have that compelling alternative. In conclusion, taking local action that supports planetary health, empowers communities and gives hope. And I think especially it does that for our young people who deserve more than what we've already given them.
Thank you, Rosemary. That was extraordinary, and I'm sure that will generate some questions from the audience. And I do prompt the audience again to pop their questions into the chat window. We have a couple more presentations and then we want to get into some open discussion, but thank you very much, Rosemary. I have a few questions noted that I'd like to follow up with you if I get the chance. Our next speaker is joining us from Boston, as we mentioned at the outset, the former Chief Executive of Sligo County Council, Ciaran Hayes. He left that role at the start of last year. I'll give you a moment there, Ciaran, to bring your slides up if you're able. Ciaran's had a 42-year career across 5 local authorities, including Galway, Kilkenny, Dublin, and I'm not even going to try and say that last one. Perhaps you can save me there, Ciaran. He's currently a senior fellow in Harvard University, researching climate change and climate action. And he's going to speak to us again, I think, about some recurring themes that we're hearing a bit of this evening. Ciaran, good evening, or good morning to you.
Yeah, good morning. Very early morning. And Sligo, I think, is that the one you were referring to?
No, it's Dun something Corporation.
Dunleary.
Dunleary. Oh, gosh, it's a lot easier than it looks. Thank you.
That's the Irish in us. Okay, good morning, and thanks indeed for the invitation. So anyway, you've gone through it, Eddie, so I'm not going to bother with that slide. And I think as everyone in this particular audience, I don't need to lecture anybody in this audience, just in terms of the policy. It comes down from the top, whether it's COP, whether it's the UN SDGs, and it cascades its way down to us at the local level. And it's that local level that where we're involved in terms of the implementation. And I often figure, we talk about adaptation and mitigation, but at local level, we're also involved in remediation because we're out there cleaning up after these particular events. In any event, in Ireland in 2015 was really our first act in terms of first legislation, in terms of trying to deal with the challenges that were coming at us. But what has happened since is quite extraordinary. We've had a plethora of legislation, National Adaptation Framework, Climate Action Plans in 2019, and the original legislation of 2015 was amended just last year in 2021. And what we're doing now is where every single public sector agency in the country is grappling with the latest climate action plan, which was adopted after COP26. And within that, there are 493 actions. And as I say, it would be wrong of me maybe to say that we're scrambling to try and deal with them. Certainly, these various actions have landed on everybody's desk, and we're certainly grappling with those issues at the moment. So in Ireland, while, as you say, Chris, I was Chief Executive in Sligo County Council. We've 31 local authorities, by the way, in Ireland. And while I was Chief Executive in Sligo, I also had a national role, which was to position the sector for the challenges of climate change that were coming at us. And, as Chief Executive, we're kind of master of all we survey within our own region, within our own boundary. And while we all operate to the same statutory powers, we all do things differently. But from a climate perspective, there was an onus on us really to cooperate and to get our adaptation and mitigation plans somewhat consistent around the country. Plus, we didn't have the expertise or the resources. The climate challenges are relatively new in terms of what it is we're facing, in terms of the scale that we're facing. And we didn't have those resources or expertise to be able to deal with them. So one of the things I did on a national basis was put together a business plan when we got approval for climate action regional offices. And there are 4 of them around the country. And these they're essentially centers of excellence, and they provide support and assistance and guidance to each of the local authorities within their region. And we've been able to deal with that consistency issue. Now, one of the challenges, one of the tasks I gave the CAROs was to come up with a training program for the entire sector. And this has been rolling out over the last year, 2 years. It's a 6-module bespoke training program. Bear in mind, we have 30,000 staff within the sector. And at this stage, we've trained over 17,000 staff. And this is everything from the entry-level staff who get an online module, all the way up to the senior management staff who get more strategic session. And included in there is this whole issue of building capacity, and that's aimed at the climate action teams within each local authority. And we go into a fair amount of detail as to the issues that are involved. So as I say, at this point, we've got over 17,000 trained. So we're rolling it out, and we're starting to see some of the benefits of the program. So for example, in one of the Dublin authorities, Dublin South County Council, they got involved in a collaboration with Amazon Web Services, where Amazon were looking to build, or have built a data center. And in building that data center, they designed it in such a manner that they could capture the excess heat and push that excess heat into a district heating scheme, which again is going to provide heating for some of the local authority offices, the libraries and schools, and other buildings within that area. There was mention there made by Rosemary in the Blue Mountains, fabulous scenery, I have to say, in the Blue Mountain city, of the public lighting. And public lighting is our biggest energy cost within the local government sector. We've in the region of 70,000 lamps in the country, and we've come at it from a national perspective. So rather than each of the 31 local authorities procuring the upgrading of the lighting, we've done it we've come at it from a national perspective, and we're actually rolling out regional contracts now to upgrade those lighting. So we're able to capture the savings, the energy savings, and the carbon emission savings, and indeed, I think we've about a 7 or an 8 year payback time on the overall project, which is costing in the region of 170 million. But more interestingly, what some of the local authorities are involved in, this is Kildare County Council, just outside of Dublin. And every council, when you think of it, we all cut grass, and we think of grass as a waste product, whereas in fact it can be a raw material. And Kildare are engaging in a project with the private sector, an anaerobic digester, where they're providing the grass to the anaerobic digester, and in return they'll get the gas from it, which will fuel some of the new fleet that they will be acquiring. This is Wicklow County Council, a car park, Wicklow County Council, and these were very smart. They got involved in a power purchase contract. So they didn't carry the capital cost of the installation of the solar panels, but what they did was they engaged, and they were able to lock in their energy costs, and they're paying in the region of 11 or 12 cents per kilowatt hour for the energy that's been produced. And in the context of the post Ukraine scenario, Russia and Ukraine scenario, given the cost of the energy and fluctuations in the energy price, the fact that they've been able to lock in that cost, I think, was a pretty good move. And then there's some low-hanging fruit. When you take it in total, the local authority sector, we have the biggest fleet in the country, and we're all now starting to engage in the renewal of that fleet, and the renewal of the fleet from to buy in electric cars and renewable energy powered cars. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and in every local authority, in every town and city, we have housing. Was mentioned again by Rosemary. I think there are poorly constructed houses in a lot of cases, certainly the houses constructed prior to 1980, and even indeed in the early 80s. Bad insulation, bad air tightness, poor heating systems. And what we find is with our own housing tenants, because they're on the margins, they buy the cheapest and the dirtiest fuel, which has impacts from an air quality perspective. So this is in Sligo, where we're upgrading or retrofitting the houses. And what we're able to do is we've got funding for them, but what we've been able to do is capture the data for those houses. We can capture the emissions, and we know from the households what their energy costs were prior to the upgrade of the houses. And in one case, we have one particular householder is saving €82 per week, over €82 per week. So we have a situation now where we're upgrading the houses. This will be a rolling project for each local authority going forward. We're able to capture the data in relation to the emissions and the savings in the carbon emissions because of the upgrades. And because these are people who are on the margins in a lot of cases, these are the tenants who are in fuel poverty. They go to the different agencies for financial assistance at different times of the year, and it includes the charities, particularly around Christmas, Holy Communion, back to school, all of those exceptional costs. But I've also got the guys to put in place air quality monitors. And as the houses are upgraded over time, and we'll be able to track the data in relation to the air quality, and I'm getting them to correlate that data, the air quality data, with admissions to the local hospital for respiratory illnesses. And again, when you analyze and assess all of that data, we will in future be in a position to go out to the private householder and try and encourage and persuade the private householder to invest in the upgrading of their property, simply from the point of view of the benefits, whether they're financial or whether they're health benefits and so on. And my final slide then is dealing with this whole issue of carbon, and carbon is really landing on our desk, and this is one that we're going to be grappling with within the local authority sector. And it's an issue that we haven't had that kind of exposure, and we're going to have to develop that competency. So whether it's carbon capture and sequestration, bioengineering, carbon capture and sequestration, or carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, it's now landing on our desk, and we're going to have to deal with it. So in Ireland now, we've all been, every sector has been allocated sector carbon budgets, and each local authority has been tasked with putting together a decarbonised zone. And that's easy in the case where you're developing a greenfield site, but it's more difficult where you're looking to retrofit town centres, and particularly the older buildings that Lawrence was talking about. It's just not so simple. Plus, even from a financial point of view, you know, this whole issue of carbon is going to have to be integrated into our own financial management systems. It's going to have to be integrated into our procurement processes, and we're going to have to take into account the whole adaptation and mitigation costs that are going to increasingly fall on us. Plus the whole area of development management, where developers are coming in looking to develop bring forward their own commercial development. There's a whole issue of how we measure the carbon cost or the carbon component of that development, and how we enforce it afterwards, and how we bring in the whole CCS, BECCS and CDR elements into it. So it's going to challenge us from a planning perspective. And as a sector, then I'm also a director of what's called NOAC, the National Oversight and Audit Commission. And that commission, it's a national commission which looks at the oversight. It's an oversight body for the local authorities around the country. And we impose key performance indicators, and we require the local authorities to report on their key performance indicators. Carbon is certainly going to feature in that into the future. So it's a whole new area that's really opening up for us. So it's real challenges there for us. So I'm going to leave it at that. I hope I haven't gone over my allocation, and then certainly available for any questions afterwards.
Thank you very much, Ciaran. You've given us much to think about there, and we will come back to you with some questions very shortly. Another reminder to the audience to please place your questions in the chat window. I think people are just enthralled by what they're hearing so far, and we'll probably get rushed with them very shortly. We do have one more speaker to bring to you. And I'd like to introduce Darcy Pimblett, who's been working in climate, energy and resilience policy at the local, state and national level for more than a decade now. I had the pleasure of meeting Darcy recently through his work with the city's Power Partnership, where Darcy is responsible for growing the network of member councils and partnerships, and he's going to talk to us a bit about the broader environment here in Australia and how councils are working towards local climate action. Darcy, good evening, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for having me, and also thanks to the other panelists tonight. It's just been really interesting to hear everything you've mentioned already. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Before I kick off, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As Chris mentioned, I'm the Program Development and Partnerships Manager for the City's Power Partnership, which is Australia's largest network of local governments who are committed to taking action on climate change. I can guarantee that in my presentation there will be some of those recurring themes, but hopefully a slightly different perspective as well, given I'll be looking at the national scale and how Australia's policy landscape has changed since COP26, how climate action is progressing at the local level, as well as the opportunities for local government to play an even greater role in achieving Australia's emissions targets and enabling, hopefully, greater ambition as well. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, and I'm assuming our international audience isn't familiar with the Cities Power Partnership, we're part of the Climate Council, which is Australia's leading climate change communications organisation. And we exist to give local governments the tools, connections and momentum that they need to take action on climate change. That includes connecting them. We know that networks are really important to local governments. We help them share knowledge, but also a big part of what we do draws on that that comms angle, which I really appreciate. As part of the Climate Council, you know, we are lucky enough to be able to draw on some of the best climate change communicators in the country. So a big part of what we do is educating and training elected representatives in particular in how to talk about climate change, and then pitching their stories out into the media to ensure that they're helping to change the narrative about climate action and local climate action in particular. So the reason that I should just give you a brief overview. At the moment, we've got 175 member councils representing 33% of all local governments in Australia. And that's 69% of Australia's population represented by our network. And this really demonstrates how active local governments are in the climate space. Together, all of our councils have pledged over 750 actions to reduce emissions through energy efficiency, renewable energy and sustainable transport rather. And the reason that we support local governments is because we know that cities and towns matter a great deal when it comes to the fight against climate change. Globally, they consume 2/3 of the world's energy, and they're responsible for 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. But they also represent a huge opportunity because 90% of those emissions can actually be cut using technologies that are readily available today. And in Australia, local governments have been really leading the charge on climate action for decades, especially during times of limited action at the state and national level. And unfortunately, there have been quite a lot of time when that has been the case. But unfortunately, climate change is also an issue that local governments can't ignore now, because local governments really are on the front lines of the climate crisis. As the closest level of government to the community, councils are often the first to respond during disasters, and they play critical roles in preparing for and recovering from extreme weather events, as we've heard from our other panelists. Climate change poses multiple risks to councils, and that includes the direct risks to their assets and their staff, as well as less direct risks like litigation and access to affordable insurance. There's also the obvious risks to their local people and communities, which are of great concern to local governments. Local governments are one of Australia's most significant infrastructure owners. They manage $450 billion worth of assets. They're also responsible for managing 75% of the country's roads. So when climate impacts happen, they hit local governments really hard. And as climate impacts like coastal erosion, flooding, bushfires, extreme storms, the list goes on. As these things continue to accelerate, we're seeing local governments really struggling to cope with both acute and ongoing chronic impacts of climate change. And as I'm sure, as Rosemary will attest in particular, many councils in Australia are really struggling now with even the basic maintenance of roads following repeat flooding events, let alone supporting their communities through those major crises that they continue to face. Litigation is also a major concern and a growing concern for local governments throughout the country, who are faced with the difficult decisions of identifying the best ways to protect their communities while minimising their exposure to litigation risk. So climate change is a critical issue for local governments throughout Australia, but there's also a great opportunity there. And we know that at the national scale, local government, when they work together, have a significant role to play in reducing national emissions and really pushing forward national ambition as well. So just to give you a brief update on the Australian political or policy landscape when it comes to climate change, we have unfortunately had almost a decade of stalled activity when it comes to climate action. Our previous government was dragged kicking and screaming to a net zero 2050 target last year, and unfortunately really came empty-handed to COP26 with no change to its previous target of 26 to 28% by 2030. But in May this year, Australia elected a new government that's committed to taking more action on climate change and will thankfully be bringing an NDC to COP27 that includes a 48% target for 2030. That's a big improvement that brings Australia closer to the rest of the developed world. But as you can see in this chart here, Australia is still at the back of the pack among developed nations. And effectively, we're still 10 years behind when it comes to climate action. We really need to be aiming higher because when you take a science-based approach, Australia really should be cutting its emissions by 75% by 2030 and reaching net zero emissions by 2035 if we're to do our fair share in avoiding the worst impacts of climate change. And that's based not only on our currently high emissions and our historical emissions, but also the enormous opportunities that Australia has as a country to act on climate change that'll actually offer massive benefits to our economy. So there's no reason why we shouldn't be pursuing these more ambitious targets, but they're obviously a challenge to achieve, and it's going to take, a concerted effort from every part of our society to achieve these targets. Fortunately, local governments are already stepping up to that challenge. So in my final slide, I just want to provide a quick summary of the potential of local government climate action, as well as some of the climate priorities that we're seeing emerging in the local government space. And to start with, it's worth pointing out that councils can have an impact on climate change through reducing emissions from their own operations, but also through emissions from their communities. So the emissions that they don't have direct control over, but can influence. And a report commissioned last year by ICLEI Oceania and the Global Covenant of Mayors found that 75% of Australian councils have set or are planning ambitious targets for their own operations. And a further 67% of Australian councils have either set or were planning targets for their community emissions. To put that in perspective, if all of those targets were to be achieved, they would have brought Australia 96% of the way to achieving that previous national target. Fortunately, we do now have a more ambitious target, but it gives you a sense of the opportunity for local governments to contribute to our NDC and hopefully also to enable more ambitious targets at the national scale. In terms of council operations, we've seen local governments really taking big strides in producing and purchasing renewable energy over the last few years. And a great example of this that came about last year was the Victorian Electricity Collaboration, which has 46 councils in the state coming together to purchase 100% renewable energy from Victorian generators. And in doing that, they're actually driving down their energy costs as well. So it's a great demonstration of how local governments can work together to really drive change in the energy system, but also deliver benefits to themselves and ultimately to their communities. We're also seeing local governments really stepping up when it comes to reducing emissions from their buildings. And we're seeing councils really now turning their attention, not just to improving energy efficiency in their buildings, but also switching their major assets like libraries and aquatic centres to gas. And that's got an enormous opportunity to reduce emissions. We're also seeing them increasingly look to how they can transition their corporate fleets to electric vehicles. That's primarily lightweight vehicles, but councils are also increasingly thinking about more heavyweight vehicles like garbage trucks. And more opportunities and more options for that are actually coming online at the moment. Achieving community emissions targets presents a bigger challenge, but it's an enormous opportunity to drive the changes we need to see at the national scale. Local governments are increasingly understanding their role in enabling their local residents and businesses to increase their access to renewable energy and energy storage, and to improve energy efficiency. And similar to their own operations, they're also understanding their role in enabling their communities to switch from gas to electricity. There are really big and necessary opportunities here for councils to work in partnership with other levels of government, as well as the private sector. This is an enormous challenge and they can't do it alone. So we're seeing local governments seeking those opportunities to work with others. As I say, local governments won't be able to drive down community emissions on their own. So they have a critical role to play when it comes to advocating to other levels of government. We need to see state and national governments taking greater action in transitioning our electricity systems to renewables. Local governments can support that through advocacy, community engagement, and supporting the rollout of infrastructure like batteries and transmission assets. They also need to work with other levels of governments to change things like planning rules and regulations to ensure that gas can be avoided in new developments, and that high levels of energy efficiency can become the standard in new buildings. And thankfully, in Australia, we have just seen an update to the National Construction Code, which will improve energy efficiency ratings to a 7-star rating. But we have also seen that not all states have adopted that, which is a real shame. And I know that local governments are really crying out and putting pressure on state governments to ensure that upgrades like that are made by all states and territories. Finally, and this one's not about reducing emissions, but it's really important. Local governments need to be and are really advocating for more support in preparing for climate impacts. At the moment, 97% of disaster funding in Australia is funneled into recovery rather than for preparedness. So we need to see that equation changing to put more power in the hands of local governments to prepare their communities for the impacts of climate change, which are becoming so stark and apparent as time progresses. I'm out of time, so I'm going to leave it there. But to recap, Australia is back at the table when it comes to climate ambition. We need to see greater ambition, and as ever, local governments are a critical player in delivering meaningful climate action at the national scale. I'll hand back over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Darcy. That was great and sobering in some ways too, particularly where we are sitting on the world scale. To see it displayed like that, I think really brought the issue home. So our audience, it's time to engage in some conversation with our panellists. If you would like to pop a question in the chat or raise your hand, I'm pretty relaxed about how we do this. I do want to start off by asking, a couple of the panellists have mentioned the importance, I gather, of seeing COP27 talked about in the media, and one of our audience members has just made a comment that it is in the media in Dublin regularly. Why is that important, do you think, and what are you hoping to see, perhaps Rosemary and then Lawrence, from COP27 in terms of the messaging and where that leads?
Look, it's just, obviously it's the issue of our age. It's the critical issue now. And it's so important that there is effective understanding and communication at a mass level. We need to really target communication as perhaps almost the major focus, because if people don't understand, and if governments don't understand, and those in multinational companies don't understand, then we're heading for not a good future. So I think there's nothing more important than effective communication, and we should do it at every level in every way. But I think we've got to be smarter, more tactical and strategic about doing it.
Yeah, I'd sort of made the comment, and based on the news feeds coming out this morning in the UK, the sort of big ones, and what was dominating was the midterm elections in the United States, which, whilst important, are not necessarily probably the number one issue that's hitting the UK at the moment. Cost of living, changes in government on a regular basis, and other things are dominating a lot of that, as well as I'm a celebrity, by the way, I must say. What I think what's required from all of this is that it's just a fairer and more balanced media approach to this. It's not necessarily that every second we're shoving down the message of COP27 and the environment and things like that, but just actually there's just a fairer balance. If you talk about what's been in the news this week, Twitter and all the other social media sites, very much the younger generation doesn't watch the BBC news like we did. There's very different methods of social media out there. And I just think, trying to get that fairer, more balanced approach to these things. I'd also, I'm just reading Alison's question as well, was these messages have got to be really simple to understand. Because I often find that when I'm on a panel or something like that, I'm coming out with a language and terms that, I practice some of this stuff on my mum. And if my mum can understand it, then I've got a pretty good chance of other people understanding it as well. But very often we talk in a language that is not common. And local government often has the ability to do that, as national governments have the ability to do that. But I think it's really important that we, with all comms, that we aim it at the broadest sort of and widest selection of our community, so that it gets the better understanding that they could. And the other thing, just before I finish, is that we must repeat those messages regularly. This is not a one-off. Climate change, road to hell and all of those things, which is what people are going to remember. It's about repeating the messages time after time after time and making them simple for people to understand.
Can I just add and say, in line with the need for a bottom-up revolution, we just have to start taking action on the ground at the bottom up and in local government areas. That applies to communications. We need a radically different approach where we empower the bottom-up message of sharing approaches at work, what the amazing things that people are doing positively, because we're being dominated by this mass communication owned by elites that is hell-bent on driving the message of an unlimited growth economy when we know that's no good. As I've said, we've got a finite planet. So we need a radical approach to communications and establishing the platforms within our cities, and Liz and I are working on that with other people in our Planetary Health Initiative to make sure there's communication platforms where we can communicate bottom up what is working and share.
Thank you both. Alison, does that answer your question, or is there something you'd like to explore a bit further with the panellists there?
No, I suppose I'm a local councillor with Dublin City Council, and I'm very conscious of the reaction at times when we put in place climate adaptation and mitigation measures. And I'm thinking, for example, cycle lanes. We've one at the moment in one of our main commuter routes into the city centre. And it's all about the chaos that it is causing from an inconvenience perspective. And I find it really frustrating that the media is not connecting why we're doing this from a climate perspective and how it contributes to the future in it. That really, I find that frustrating, both on the ground and with my colleagues in the council. It can be overwhelming. So I'm conscious that you want to send positive messaging that we are on a road to improvement. And the other thing, the comments I'll make back to you, Lawrence, on the midterms, they're also paralleling here on that. If only they would make the connection between the midterms in the US and the impact on climate policy in the States, then we could actually get a political dialogue going that connects political ideology with climate action on the ground. And I think you demonstrated that the last speaker there in Australia about your last government and your current government, because that also is really important. And when you talk about bottom up, people on the ground also have to be politically in tune with the climate policies of their local representatives, and also where they stand when it comes to not in my backyard. I think that's really important as well.
Thank you, Alison. Ciaran, I sense you might want to add something.
This is a really difficult issue that we're left grappling with. And Alison, just to say that I'm a fellow Dub, even though I live in Galway, but I'm coming to you this morning from Boston. Coming at it from the local authority perspective, there's a lot of really good initiatives coming out, whether they're the cycle lanes or whatever the initiative is. And they're being researched on the basis of, we do our due diligence, we get our advisors in, we get the best engineering, planning, architectural advice, whatever it is, and we make our recommendations to the political bodies who make their decisions on the basis of the impact on their votes. And that's a real conundrum as to how we shape those recommendations that we actually try to bring forward to the councils themselves. But I think it's a real challenge. I think we have an opportunity, and we've a way to go within local government. I think we have an opportunity there. Each local authority in Ireland has what's called a public participation network, which is a way into the local communities, people that are active at the local community level. And I think we have an opportunity to train up our own staff who are engaging and supporting those public participation networks so that we can animate a discussion at that local level. And we can change the narrative and change the momentum. And I always feel, you know, we're an animal species, and we act and we have a herd mentality. And if we're in a position to develop a momentum at that local level, then that will make it much easier for the political bodies to be able to make the decisions, the hard decisions that are in the interest of the local community.
Thanks, Ciaran. I noticed that Darcy's just added a link to an example of media messaging training for local elected representatives in the chat. Much appreciated. Thank you, Darcy. Ciaran, while we have you there, I have had a question come directly to me that I think is one for you, and it's about whether you've got any pro tips on how you go about implementing carbon accounting, because it could appear to be a bit of a weird science to many. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's well, as I said in the presentation, it's one that is starting to hit our desks now, and I would see it even from the point of view of future development. And we're all in favour of developing our own towns, our own cities and counties. But it's one that we're going to have to, we are grappling with, and we'll have to grapple with in the future. And I think it's an area, I just put up on the screen there, carbon capture and sequestration, bioengineering carbon capture and sequestration. These are not simple issues. And there are, and in fact, I was at a conference there at the weekend here in Boston, where there's a whole market now, a utility market has opened up in terms of carbon emissions. So, you know, we're going to have to get very familiar ourselves with this whole issue of the trading of carbon. When a developer comes in and wants to bring forward a development that's going to have a carbon element in it, they're going to have to demonstrate how they're going to offset that particular carbon component of their development. And the way I would see it happening in future is they will buy the credits from some of these private sector entities that are out there developing the credits. They're planting forests, they're sequestering the carbon into the ground and so on. And I can see a situation, foresee a situation in the future where developers will have to come in and provide some kind of certification that they're able to offset the carbon component of their particular development. So it's an interesting, it's not an area local government has been involved in to date.
Thanks, Ciaran. Rosemary?
Oh, Chris, I was just going to say one thing that the councils can do that we did was we established a carbon revolving reserve, and we invested 2.5 million into emissions reduction projects. And we calculated that delivered a 24% reduction in our operational emissions. And we also calculated delivered over 500,000 of operational savings. Just a little way of trying to put a dollar on the value of that investment in emission reduction.
How many councils are you aware of that actually undertake an exercise like that, Rosemary?
I'm so busy focusing on our City of Blue Mountains, I don't have a clue. The better person to ask might be Darcy.
Darcy might have an idea. Is that common yet?
I don't have the statistics off the top of my head. It's not uncommon. We do see quite a lot of local governments taking that up now, particularly when it comes to energy efficiency and saving the benefits of that and rolling it into ongoing sustainability initiatives. So there definitely are quite a number of councils who've successfully done that in Australia.
That's good to know. Rosemary, a couple of times in your presentation, you used the word political. Local government is political. You talked about declaring a climate emergency, which many have talked about is ultimately a political act. Can you talk a bit more about managing the political element of these issues? Because that can be a sticking point for some.
I'd like to begin by just acknowledging that we've been very fortunate in the City of Blue Mountains to have great political leadership, and otherwise we wouldn't have been able to carry through our sustainability Plainfield vision and action plan from 2000 all the way through to now. It's slightly modified, but it's still the framework running the city and the council, and that obviously had to be endorsed by the council. One of the tricks and ways, I guess, is how you work with the political leadership. And I remember when we did so much consultation, we said to the councillors, let us do the consultation and then we'll come to you and then the decision will be yours, but you'll hear what the voice of the community was. So they understood that they would come in at the end rather than interfering as we did it. It was important to hear that voice of community, and then they, as the representatives of that, the elected representatives, were able to decide. Another thing is when we did all that work, it was almost 3 years of engagement to shape a solid foundation of a vision and a action plan. We didn't present it to council just as a vision and action plan. We presented it as the policy framework for the city for them to adopt, and they did adopt it. So I'm just sort of saying how you present things, how you engage. Our leadership is fabulous. Look, we like any city, we have our challenges and opportunities. I think it's important in how you communicate, how you work with all your stakeholders. It's managing up, managing across, managing everywhere, in every direction. So we're only successful because our political leadership has had the foresight to know that for our city that's located in a World Heritage Area, this is absolutely critical that we be a leader in this area and work towards being a leader. We haven't always got it right, as I've said. So I would say, look, it can be tricky, and I think I would argue that the state and federal government could learn a lot from local level government. As Darcy said, I think cities Power Partnership is an incredible organisation as well. We're very proud to be part of it. And I think we're showing the other levels of government what can happen with this bottom-up revolution, because the world's made up of local government areas, and planetary health only happens when you have a systems view and understand the interactivity of social, economic, environmental, and all factors, very complex. And you have to understand that interaction. Local governments are in a position to better see that and manage it because they're doing a geographical area, whereas state government might be just looking at housing or transport in isolation. And the scientists, they're looking at reductionist. They're not looking at, they're looking at fragments of they reduce down. But what's needed is whole of systems theory to drive this.
Thanks, Rosemary. We're just about out of time, but I do want to get to perhaps one final question. A couple of you have talked about the advocacy role at the local government level, and Darcy pointed out that the bulk of the funding coming from other levels is going towards response rather than preparedness. I wonder whether maybe Lawrence, maybe Ciaran, in your environments, has that advocacy task for local government gotten any easier over the last couple of years as the climate problem has become perhaps more accepted at higher levels of government? Or you might challenge that comment.
Well, I'll be very simple. Response to this is that no, it's not getting any easier.
Right.
Certainly the way that funding is applied in England, I can't speak for the other devolved nations, has become a bit of a competition between areas. So there is a pot of money and you all have to bid into that pot of money, and there is a set list of priorities that you then have to bid against. And very often, well, not very often, more often than not, they are about local economic growth. The aspect of climate change or biodiversity is very low in the priority, if at all. And so therefore, it's not easy at the current time. You know, if somebody's to ask you what's the UK's climate change agenda, you may remember Boris Johnson's 10-point plan. Don't think it's been mentioned since. And so therefore, it's really, really difficult to get traction for those things because funding is prioritised to areas for economic growth, for poverty, and lots of things that are absolutely the right thing to do. But that does leave out areas such as ours, which are impacted by the climate. There isn't really anything there, and we have to wait years and years and years and years for some national environment agency or whatever to come up with those type of things. So it's not a natural process yet. But I'm hopeful. I'm ever hopeful.
Thanks, Lawrence. Ciaran, anything to add?
It's really, just as Lawrence says, it's quite difficult. I mean, and what I've found is that, and it's not pointing any fingers or being accusatory, but in Irish local government, we deal with a lot of government departments at the central level, and the dots were not being joined. That's what I found. And in one case, and again, without being, I'm not pointing any fingers, but it's just people were not aware of the requirements. For the slide I put up for the housing redevelopment that we were doing in Sligo, I got approval for that from central level. We were getting central funding. And the new heating system that I got approval for was an oil condensing boiler. And I had to go back to the government department and say, no, I can't install that because it's contrary to government policy of another government department. So it's not that there was anything deliberate in it. It was just, it's not on people's agenda. And I think the real challenge for us is to ensure that whatever we do at central government level or at local level, whatever individual departments we have within our organizations, climate is a part of the process, all the way through from the design of projects to the procurement of projects to the construction to the ongoing management and maintenance. That climate becomes an element of it. In the same way in Ireland, what happened in Ireland over the last number of years with health and safety, it is ingrained into every aspect of your operations. Climate has to be treated in the very same manner. And it's just one final note, Lawrence, just to say to you that COP27 did in fact appear in the UK media, but it was from the point of view that Rishi Sunak wasn't going and that Boris Johnson was going.
All right, we might leave it on that note. Thank you, Ciaran. Thank you to all of our panelists for all of your time and your insights. You've been very generous with us this evening. We do have to draw a line under it. Now, in answer to a question that somebody did ask in the chat, the session has been recorded and it will be post-produced and made available to VLGA and LGIU members. In fact, what we're finding these days is a lot of people register so they get access to that recording, even if they can't join us live, as we've had a quality but small group join us this evening. So Dr Rosemary Dillon from Blue Mountains, Lawrence Conway from South Lakeland, Ciaran Hayes from Boston and Harvard, looking forward to getting some sleep very shortly, I'm sure, and Darcy Pimblett from Cities Power Partnership. Thank you all for being part of our session this evening. I want to acknowledge that Councillor Denise Massoud, the President of the VLGA, has joined us. Hello, Denise. Nice to see you here this evening.
Hi,
I hope we've done the VLGA proud. So to all of you, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again very soon on another Global Executive Panel. Good night.